You've seen the paintings, a quiet garden, soft moonlight falling through ancient olive trees, Jesus kneeling alone in perfect stillness, hands folded, face serene, while his disciples sleep peacefully nearby. Everything bathed in a kind of sacred golden calm. Forget that image entirely. The night before Jesus was arrested was not quiet. It was not peaceful. It was not the composed, meditative scene that centuries of Western art have trained us to imagine. It was a night soaked in sweat and whispered arguments, in the smell of torch smoke and unwashed bodies crowding narrow streets, in the sound of a city still buzzing hours after the largest festival of the Jewish year. It was a night of betrayal already in motion, of armed men moving through darkness, of fear so physical it could be tasted. What really happened between the Last Supper and the moment the soldiers arrived? What was the city of Jerusalem actually like that night? What were the disciples feeling, hearing, smelling? What did Judas do, step by step, in the hours after he left the table? And why does understanding all of this change the way we read those gospel accounts forever? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels, and it changes how we understand what Jesus walked into, deliberately, with full knowledge, on the most important night in human history. To understand that night, you have to understand the city itself. Jerusalem during Passover was not the quiet, manageable town it was during the rest of the year. The city's normal population in the first century sat somewhere between 25,000 and 40,000 people. But in the days leading up to Passover, that number exploded. Jewish pilgrims flooded in from across the Roman Empire, from Egypt, from Babylon, from Syria, from Rome itself. Ancient sources, including the Jewish historian Josephus, describe the crowds as reaching numbers that strain belief. The city, already dense and compact, became something closer to a pressure cooker. Every available surface became sleeping space. Rooftops, courtyards, the narrow streets themselves. Families who had walked for days or weeks arrived tired, carrying their animals for sacrifice, their oil, their unleavened bread, their bundles of bitter herbs. The air around the Temple Mount during this season carried the permanent heavy smell of blood and burning fat, because thousands of Passover lambs were being slaughtered and roasted simultaneously across the city. That smell reached every corner of Jerusalem. There was no escaping it. It was the smell of the festival. It was the smell of memory, of Egypt, of the angel of death passing over, of freedom purchased through blood. And if you were walking the streets of Jerusalem that night, the night of the Passover meal itself, you would not be walking through silence. The Passover Seder was not a quiet, personal affair. It was a meal of obligation, of recitation, of songs called Hallel, drawn from the Psalms, loud communal hymns of praise that Jewish families sang together in full voice. The sound of those songs rising from thousands of homes and courtyards simultaneously would have filled the air of Jerusalem like nothing else in the ancient world. Matthew and Mark both record that Jesus and his disciples sang a hymn before leaving for the Mount of Olives. That was not incidental. That was the second half of the Hallel, Psalms 115 through 118, traditionally sung at the end of the Passover meal, which means the streets of Jerusalem that night echoed with those same words from thousands of other households, all at roughly the same time. This is the world that swallowed Judas when he slipped away from the upper room. If you want to follow the channels that this kind of content opens, the kind that rebuilds the real world around the Gospels, stone by stone, smell by smell, consider staying close. There's far more of this ahead. Judas left before the meal ended. The Gospel of John is specific about this. He went out, and it was night. A detail John records with the weight of a verdict. But going out into that night meant entering a city that was anything but asleep. The streets of Jerusalem during Passover night were full of people finishing their meals, stepping out onto rooftops, calling across courtyards. Roman soldiers moved in organized patrols through the main streets, their armor catching the light of oil lamps hung in doorways. The temple guard maintained its own separate presence, particularly around the outer courts where pilgrims camped. Judas had to move fast, and he had to move carefully. His destination was the chief priests, men who had already paid him 30 pieces of silver, according to Matthew, the price of a slave under Mosaic law. The arrangement had been made days earlier. Now Judas was delivering the critical piece of information they needed, where Jesus would be that night, after the meal, away from the crowds that had been protecting him all week. Because that was the problem the chief priests faced. All week, Jesus had been teaching in the temple courts in full daylight, surrounded by thousands of Passover pilgrims, many of whom had welcomed him into the city just days earlier with palm branches and shouts of Hosanna. To arrest him publicly in that environment risked exactly the kind of popular uprising that Roman authority watched for like hawks. The prefect Pontius Pilate was in Jerusalem for the festival specifically because Passover was the most politically volatile week of the Jewish calendar. Any disturbance, any riot, any public confrontation between the crowd and the authorities could spiral into disaster. The chief priests could not afford that. Rome could not afford that. So the arrest had to happen at night. It had to happen away from the crowds. It had to happen in a place where there would be no witnesses who could trigger a response from the thousands of sleeping pilgrims packed into every corner of the city. Judas gave them exactly what they needed. The Garden of Gethsemane, or more precisely, an olive grove on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives, just east of the city, across the Kidron Valley, was a place Jesus returned to regularly. John tells us this explicitly. Jesus often met there with his disciples. Judas knew it. And now the chief priests knew it too. The Kidron Valley at night was a different world from the city above it. Jerusalem sat on a ridge, and the Kidron cut along its eastern edge like a scar. A deep, narrow ravine that separated the city walls from the Mount of Olives. During the day, the valley floor was trafficked, dusty, practical. But at night, particularly during Passover when a full moon hung over the festival, the valley took on a different quality. The moonlight during Passover was not incidental. The Jewish lunar calendar placed the festival at the full moon of the month of Nisan, which means that the night Jesus crossed the Kidron with his disciples was lit by the brightest moon of the spring season. Shadows were sharp and deep. The white limestone of the city walls reflected light back into the darkness. The olive trees on the far slope were visible from the bridge crossing the valley. This matters because it means the group moving from the upper room to the garden was not moving through total darkness. They were moving through a moonlit city, across a moonlit valley, into an olive grove where the trees themselves cast pools of deep shadow broken by columns of pale light. The sensory experience of that walk, the cool air after the warmth of the Passover meal, the distant sound of Hallel songs still echoing from windows and rooftops, the smell of smoke and roasting meat beginning to thin as they descended toward the valley, was specific, physical, real. Jesus had been here many times. His feet knew this path. But something was different about the way he walked it this time. Luke, who writes with a physician's attention to physical detail, records that in the garden, Jesus' sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground, a condition that modern medicine recognizes as hematidrosis, a rare but documented physiological response to extreme psychological stress. in which capillaries near the sweat glands rupture and blood seeps into the perspiration. Whether read as literal or as vivid metaphor, Luke's description communicates something that the softer paintings never do. Jesus was in physical distress. His body was responding to what his mind knew was coming. The garden was not a scene of serene resignation. It was a scene of a man pressing through the most acute anguish imaginable, choosing, in real time, not to turn back. He went a stone's throw beyond his disciples. That precise distance is Luke's detail, the distance a person withdraws when they need to be alone, but not entirely separated. And he fell on his face. Matthew uses that phrase deliberately, not kneeling, not sitting. On his face, in the dirt of an olive grove, on a moonlit night in April, with the smell of the festival city drifting across the valley behind him. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. The disciples, meanwhile, were doing what exhausted men do after a long, emotionally charged evening. They slept. This detail has frustrated and puzzled readers for 2,000 years, and it has often been interpreted as spiritual failure, as weakness, as a kind of moral abandonment. But the physical context softens that judgment considerably. These were working men, fishermen, a tax collector, tradesmen, who had spent the entire week of Passover in a state of heightened alertness. Jerusalem during that week was tense. The confrontations in the temple, the arguments with the Pharisees and scribes, the growing sense that something was accelerating toward a crisis. All of it had been accumulating for days. And then came the Passover meal itself, hours long, involving multiple cups of wine, substantial food, the full recitation of the Haggadah, the singing of the Hallel, the walk to the garden afterward, across the valley, in the cool night air after warmth and wine. After weeks of tension, the body closes down. The eyes grow heavy. The mind, saturated with too much to process, retreats. 3 times Jesus returned to find them sleeping. 3 times he woke them. 3 times they could not hold their eyes open. There is something in this repetition that feels less like judgment and more like grief. He was alone in the most complete sense, surrounded by people who loved him but could not stay awake to witness what he was carrying. Across the valley, something very different was happening. The arresting party was assembling. John's Gospel describes it with a specificity that rewards careful reading. It was not a small group of temple guards with a few torches. John uses the Greek word spera, a cohort. A Roman cohort at full strength numbered 600 men. Scholars debate whether John means a full cohort or a detachment, but even a fraction of that number, 60, 100, 200 soldiers, combined with the temple guard and the servants of the chief priests, represents a substantial armed force. They came with lanterns and torches and weapons. This detail is almost jarring. Lanterns and torches on a night with a full Passover moon. Why bring artificial light to a night already illuminated by the brightest moon of the season? Because they were afraid. An olive grove at night, even under a full moon, is a place of deep shadow beneath the canopy. They did not know exactly where in the grove Jesus would be. They did not know if his disciples would be armed. They did not know if the crowds from the city might somehow be alerted. The torches and lanterns were not ceremonial. They were the light of men who were nervous, who were moving into unknown terrain to arrest someone whose following they feared, on a night when the wrong outcome could ignite the entire city. Judas walked at the front of this column. He had given them the signal in advance. The man I kiss is the one you want. Seize him. This was a practical necessity, not merely a dramatic betrayal. In the dim, shadow-striped light of the olive grove, with a group of Galilean men all dressed in similar fashion, a positive identification by someone who knew Jesus personally was the only reliable way to ensure the right man was taken. The kiss was a gesture of greeting between teacher and student in that culture. Not uncommon, not suspicious to anyone watching from the outside. It was chosen precisely because it would look, to any observer, like a disciple greeting his rabbi. The column moved out of the city, down through the lower gate, across the bridge over the Kidron, up the lower slope of the Mount of Olives, following a path that Judas knew from having walked it many times in the company of the man he was now leading soldiers toward. The torches would have been visible from the garden, the sound of armed men moving in formation, the clink of metal, the shuffle of sandaled feet on dry ground, the low commands of officers keeping the column together, would have reached the garden before the column itself arrived. Jesus woke his disciples for the last time. "Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." He did not run. He did not hide in the shadows of the olive trees, though the shadows were deep enough and the grove wide enough that he could have. He stood up, walked toward the approaching torches, and called out to the column before they reached him. "Who is it you want?" The moment the arresting party arrived at the garden, the careful, controlled plan the chief priests had constructed began to come apart at the edges. John records something in this scene that the other Gospels either omit or describe differently, and it is one of the strangest, most overlooked details in the entire Passion narrative. When Jesus stepped forward and identified himself, "I am he," the column of soldiers and temple guards drew back and fell to the ground. The Greek is unambiguous. They fell. A cohort of armed Roman soldiers and trained temple guards, carrying weapons and torches, confronting a single unarmed man in an olive grove in the middle of the night, collapsed backward onto the ground at the sound of his voice. Scholars have debated this for centuries. Was it supernatural? Was it the sheer unexpected boldness of a man walking toward his arresters rather than fleeing? Was it the weight of the moment pressing down on men who, on some level, understood they were doing something that could not be undone? The text does not explain. It simply records what happened, with the same plain, documentary tone John uses for everything else. They drew back and fell to the ground. Jesus asked them again, "Who is it you want?" They answered again, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he said again, "I am he," and added, "If you are looking for me, let these others go." This is a detail that slides past quickly in most readings, but it carries an enormous weight when placed in its physical context. Jesus was not negotiating for his own safety. He was negotiating for the safety of his disciples, in real time, standing in front of an armed column at night, in a grove outside a city full of soldiers who had been on heightened alert all week. The disciples were vulnerable. If the arrest turned into a confrontation, if anyone ran, if the soldiers decided to take everyone present for questioning, the night could end very differently for all of them. Jesus' words, "Let these others go," were not theological. They were the words of a man who understood exactly how dangerous the situation was and was using the one leverage he had, his willingness to cooperate, to protect the people standing behind him. Then Peter moved. In any honest reconstruction of this night, Peter's action with the sword deserves to be examined not as a footnote, but as the eruption it actually was. He drew a blade and swung it at the servant of the high priest, a man named Malchus, a detail John alone preserves with the specificity of an eyewitness, and cut off his right ear. This was not a symbolic gesture. Peter was not making a point. He was attempting to kill a man. A strike aimed at the head, in a close-quarters confrontation at night, in the flickering light of torches and lanterns, by a fisherman with no military training, is not a surgical move. The fact that it took off an ear rather than splitting a skull is more accident than precision. Peter was swinging to defend his rabbi with the panicked, untrained force of a man who had spent the entire evening hearing increasingly alarming things and was now watching armed soldiers lay hands on the person he had pledged his life to protect just hours before. The chaos of that moment, the shout, the blade, the blood, the crowd surging back, the torches lurching, the disciples scrambling, lasted only seconds before Jesus stepped into it. "Put your sword away," he said to Peter. "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" And then, in a detail only Luke records, he touched the man's ear and healed him. The physician who wrote Luke's Gospel notes this with quiet precision. Jesus, in the moment of his own arrest, under torchlight, surrounded by armed men, with his disciples in disarray around him, reached out and healed the man who had come to take him away. The column steadied. The disciples, seeing that resistance was futile and that Jesus was not going to fight, scattered. Mark records one of the most peculiar details in all of gospel literature. A young man who had been following the group, wearing nothing but a linen cloth, was grabbed by one of the soldiers, and he fled naked, leaving the cloth behind. Who this young man was, why he was there, why Mark, and only Mark, records it, has been debated endlessly. What it communicates, whatever its explanation, is the texture of real chaos, the confusion, the bodies moving in every direction, the darkness beyond the torchlight full of fleeing shadows. And then they bound Jesus and led him back across the Kidron. What followed was a night of movement through a city that never fully slept. The trial, or more precisely, the series of interrogations that preceded the formal trial, began immediately, in the hours before dawn, at the house of the high priest. This sequence requires understanding the geography of first-century Jerusalem, particularly the upper city, where the wealthiest and most powerful priestly families maintained their large stone houses. These were not modest homes. Archaeological excavations in what is today the Jewish quarter of the Old City have uncovered the remains of mansion-scale residences from the Herodian period, houses with multiple rooms, mosaic floors, ritual baths, plastered walls decorated in the fresco style that wealthier Jerusalem residents adopted from Roman fashion. The high priest's house was the largest and most prestigious of these. To reach it from the Kidron Valley, the arresting party had to move through the lower city, up the steep stepped streets that climbed from the valley floor toward the upper ridge. Jerusalem was built on hills, and moving through it at night meant moving through streets that were simultaneously flat passages and sudden staircases, through neighborhoods that pressed close on both sides, past the sleeping forms of pilgrims who had claimed every available surface. The torches of the column would have woken people as they passed. Heads would have lifted from bedrolls on rooftops. Voices would have asked, in low tones, what was happening. Most would have turned over and gone back to sleep. They had seen Roman soldiers moving through the city at night before. It was not unusual enough to investigate. Jesus walked bound through all of it. Peter followed at a distance. This is one of the most humanly recognizable details in the entire Passion narrative. He did not run with the others. He could not bring himself to run. But he could not bring himself to walk at Jesus' side either. He followed behind, far enough back to be unrecognizable in the crowd, close enough to see where they were taking him. It is the movement of a man caught between love and fear, pulled forward by one and held back by the other. Moving through the dark streets of Jerusalem in the hours before dawn, not knowing yet what the night would cost him. The high priest's courtyard was where he stopped. A fire had been lit in the center of the open courtyard. John and Luke both record this, And it is another of those small physical details that anchor the scene in reality. It was April in Jerusalem, which meant spring nights were cold enough to make a courtyard fire welcome. The servants and guards who had gathered there were warming themselves, waiting for whatever was going to unfold inside the house. Peter joined them. The courtyard fire is one of the most important physical details in the entire Passion narrative, and it is almost always underread. In first-century Jerusalem, a courtyard fire at night was a social space. People gathered around it not just for warmth, but for the particular human intimacy that firelight creates. The way it pulls strangers into a shared circle. The way it makes faces visible while leaving the surrounding darkness impenetrable. The way it dissolves, temporarily. The formal distances that daylight maintains. The servants and guards warming themselves around that fire were not a crowd. They were a small group, close together, faces visible to one another in the flickering light. There was nowhere to hide in that circle. There was no anonymity. Peter had placed himself in the worst possible position for a man trying to remain unrecognized. The first challenge came from a servant girl, not a soldier, not an official, not someone with any authority to arrest him. A servant girl who looked at his face in the firelight and said, simply, "This man was with him." Peter denied it. "I don't know him." The words came fast, too fast. The denial of a man who has already been rehearsing it in his mind during the long walk from the garden. He moved away from the fire, toward the gateway, into the slightly deeper shadow at the edge of the courtyard. But the gateway was not dark enough. Someone else saw him and said the same thing. "You are one of them." Peter denied it again. And then, about an hour later, Luke's detail, that hour, the specific wait of 60 minutes of sitting in that courtyard with his denial already spoken twice. Someone else pressed the point, more forcefully this time. Certainly, this man was with him, for he is a Galilean. The accent gave him away. Galilean Aramaic was distinct enough from Judean Aramaic that it was recognizable to Jerusalem ears. Rougher, with different vowel sounds, the kind of regional accent that marks a person as an outsider the moment they open their mouth. Peter could change where he stood. He could pull his cloak around his face. He could not change the way he spoke. And so Peter, for the third time, denied knowing Jesus. And immediately, while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. Luke records what happens next with a single sentence that contains more emotional devastation than most paragraphs in ancient literature. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Jesus was being moved through the courtyard at that moment, from one part of the interrogation to another, bound, under guard, in the hours before dawn. And across the courtyard, through the firelight and the darkness, he turned and looked at Peter. Not with words, not with a gesture, just a look. And Peter remembered. He went outside and wept bitterly. To understand the full weight of that moment, you have to hold together several things simultaneously. Earlier that same evening, at the table, Peter had declared with complete sincerity that he would go to prison and to death for Jesus. He had meant it. The declaration was not performance. It was the genuine expression of a man who believed, in that moment, that he was capable of exactly that kind of loyalty. And then, within hours, under pressure from a servant girl and the cold of an April night and the social exposure of a firelit courtyard, he had denied 3 times even knowing the man he had pledged his life to. The rooster crow was not, in this world, a quaint rural detail. Roosters in Jerusalem crowed at a specific point in the Roman night watch. The third watch, called the Gallicinium in Latin, the cock crow, occurring somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning. The Romans had divided the night into 4 watches, and the third watch was marked by this sound. It was a clock. When the rooster crowed, every soldier on duty, every guard in a watchtower, every person lying awake in the sleeping city knew what time it was. It was the middle of the night. It was the hour when the body is most depleted, when resolve is hardest to maintain, when the darkness feels most complete. Peter had not simply failed. He had failed at the exact hour Jesus had predicted he would fail, using the exact detail Jesus had specified. Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And the convergence of those 2 realities, the prediction and the fulfillment, crashing together in a single moment of eye contact across a firelit courtyard, broke him. Inside the house, the interrogation continued. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered with a directness that, in the social codes of that world, bordered on insolence. I have spoken openly to the world, he said. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. They know what I said. One of the officials standing nearby struck him across the face. Is that any way to answer the high priest? Jesus absorbed the blow and responded with the same steady, undeflectable calm. If I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? This exchange, a bound prisoner, struck in the face, responding not with rage and not with submission, but with a clear, precise, unanswerable question, is one of the most remarkable moments in the entire Passion account. It reveals something about Jesus in these hours that the serene garden paintings entirely obscure. He was not passive. He was not broken. He was present, alert, choosing every word with precision, maintaining a dignity that no amount of physical coercion could reach, because it was not located in any external condition that could be taken from him. The night ground on. False witnesses were brought in and could not agree with each other. The high priest pushed for a direct answer about identity. Jesus gave it. The council declared it blasphemy. The guards began to mock him, blindfolding him, striking him, demanding he prophesy who had hit him. The contempt in these actions was institutional, normalized. The behavior of men who had been given permission to treat a bound prisoner as less than human. It was ugly and ordinary at once, which is the worst kind of cruelty. And through all of it, somewhere outside, Peter wept in the dark. By the time the first pale light of dawn began to appear above the Mount of Olives, the same slopes where, just hours before, Jesus had knelt in an olive grove and asked if the cup could pass. The outline of what this night had accomplished was already visible. A city had slept through it. Thousands of pilgrims, wrapped in their cloaks on rooftops and in courtyards, having sung the Hallel and eaten the lamb and remembered Egypt, had turned over in the night without knowing that something far older than Egypt was being decided in a courtyard fire and an interrogation room and a garden of olive trees just across the valley. The disciples were scattered. Peter was broken. Judas, according to Matthew, would not survive his own guilt past the morning. And Jesus, bound, struck, mocked, having healed the ear of the man who came to arrest him and protected his disciples with words rather than force, having sweat blood in a garden and walked through it all with a clarity that never wavered. Jesus was still standing. This is what the night before the crucifixion actually was. Not silence, not golden light through olive branches, not the composed serenity of devotional art. It was chaos and cold and firelight, and a rooster crowing in the third watch of the night, and a man weeping outside a gate, and a servant girl who recognized an accent, and soldiers falling backward in an olive grove, and a physician recording the detail of a healed ear in a moment when no one else thought to mention it. And underneath all of that noise and darkness and failure and fear, something was holding. Something that no arrest, no blow across the face, no denial by a friend, no conspiracy of powerful men could reach or diminish or extinguish. That is what this night reveals, when you see it as it actually was. Not a man resigned to fate in a quiet garden. A man who knew exactly what the night contained, who walked toward it across a moonlit valley, who healed in the moment of his own arrest, who answered questions with perfect clarity while bound, who looked across a courtyard at a man who had just denied him 3 times, and whose gaze, in that look, contained not condemnation, but something that Peter would spend the rest of his life trying to find words for. Understanding this does not make the story more theological, it makes it more human, and somehow, in being more human, it becomes more extraordinary.